Everyone turned against him in court. Then his wife revealed who she really was. "Do you have anything to say before this court, Mrs. Mercer?" Lucia Bergman stood in that federal courtroom with every eye fixed on her like she was already convicted. Her husband sat 3 rows back, his face a war between love and doubt. His father sat beside him, wearing the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd just won. She looked at the judge, then at the prosecutor who'd spent 3 days painting her as a thief, a con artist, a woman who'd married into the Mercer family for one reason only, to rob them blind. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "Before we proceed further, there's something this court needs to know about who I actually am." The prosecutor shifted. Lawrence Mercer's expression flickered, just for a second, from confidence to something else. "I'm not just a watchmaker," Lucia continued, "and my credentials might change the context of everything presented in this courtroom. What happened in the next 10 minutes didn't just clear her name. It shattered everything the Mercer family thought they knew about the woman their son had married. But to understand how we got there, we need to go back 3 years. Welcome to Mr. Cael Stories, where we bring you narratives that move you, challenge you, and stay with you long after they end. If you're new here, subscribe and join our community. And if this story makes you feel something, anything, drop a comment below. Let's talk about trust, love, and the secrets we keep from the people who matter most. Now, let's begin. The restoration workshop at Mercer & Sons Horological House smelled like machine oil and centuries-old brass, and at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in October, it belonged to exactly one person. Lucia Bergman sat hunched over a 1847 Vacheron Constantin pocket watch, loupe pressed to her eye, tweezers in hand, extracting a hairspring so delicate that breathing wrong could snap it. She'd been working on this piece for 6 hours straight, and the world had narrowed to the mechanical universe in her hands. "You're holding your breath," a voice said behind her. She didn't startle. Years of precision work had trained that reflex out of her, but she did exhale slowly before setting down her tools and turning. Julian Mercer stood in the doorway of his family's workshop wearing jeans and a shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, looking nothing like the corporate air she'd expected when the company contracted her for this restoration. He had dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, sharp features softened by exhaustion, and eyes that tracked to the pocket watch on her bench with the kind of hunger she recognized because she felt it too. "Your shock spring mount is off by 0.2 millimeters, he said, crossing to her workstation. "Everything after that is going to run fast, because the one thing under it is wrong." She checked. He was right. "I hate when people are right," she said. He smiled, not arrogant, just easy, like he'd found something unexpected and didn't quite know what to do with it yet. "I know the feeling." He pulled up a stool beside her. "You're Lucia Bergman, Amos's protege. He talks about you like you're the second coming of Breguet himself." "Amos exaggerates." "Does he?" Julian gestured to the Vacheron Constantin. "Most watchmakers won't touch a piece this old. You took the contract without hesitation." "Most watchmakers don't love the work enough to risk failing at it," she said. "I'd rather try and fail than never know if I could have saved something beautiful." Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or interest that went deeper than professional. "I know that feeling too." They worked side by side until 3 in the morning. He brought coffee from the all-night diner on Ashford Street that tasted burnt in a way she found comforting. She showed him an adjustment technique she'd learned from Amos that made him shake his head in admiration. Somewhere in those hours, the space between them began to hum with something neither of them named, but both of them felt. When she finally packed her tools, he walked her to her car. "Same time Thursday?" he asked. "The Vacheron will be ready for movement assembly by then," she said. "I wasn't asking about the watch." She looked at him, really looked, and saw everything she'd been trained to notice. The vulnerability in how he stood, the question in his eyes, the wanting he wasn't quite ready to speak out loud. "Thursday," she agreed. Thursday became a week of Thursdays, then a month. The restoration work gave them an excuse, but they'd stopped pretending it was about the watches by the time November arrived with its early darkness and cold that made the heated workshop feel like the only warm place in the world. She learned he'd chosen watchmaking over the executive path his father had planned for him. That he'd learned the craft because building something with his hands felt more real than anything he'd done in boardrooms. That his mother had died when he was 16, and sometimes he still wound her favorite watch, a Patek Philippe his father kept in a safe, just to hear it tick. He learned she'd grown up in a 3-room apartment above a pawn shop, where she'd first seen an antique watch in pieces and asked the owner if she could try to fix it. That Amos had found her there at 14, working on a mechanism she had no business understanding, and had taken her on as an apprentice. That she read mechanical diagrams the way other people read poetry. "Why watchmaking?" he asked one night, their shoulders touching as they bent over a schematic. "Because a watch is the only honest thing I've ever known," she said. "It doesn't lie about what it is. Every piece has a purpose. Everything fits together in a way that makes sense. When it's broken, there's a reason. When you fix it, it works. There's no pretending." He turned to look at her, close enough that she could see the darker ring around his irises, close enough to feel the warmth of him in the small space between them. "I don't think I've ever heard anyone describe it that way," he said quietly. "How would you describe it?" "The same way," he said. "Exactly the same way." He kissed her then, slow and deliberate, his hand coming up to cradle her jaw like she was something rare he was afraid to break. She tasted coffee and wanting, and 3 months of almost, and when she pulled back just far enough to breathe, she saw her own hunger reflected in his eyes. "We should probably talk about this," she whispered. "Probably," he agreed, and kissed her again. The first time they made love was in her apartment above the antique bookstore, on Mariner's Walk, with the winter rain tapping against the windows, and the sounds of the city humming below them. Julian had driven her home after another late night at the workshop, and when she'd invited him up, ostensibly for tea, actually because the thought of him leaving made her chest feel hollow, he'd accepted with an eagerness he didn't bother hiding. Her apartment was small and crowded with books and half-restored timepieces, and he'd looked around like he was memorizing it, learning her through the space she lived in. "It's not much," she said, suddenly aware of the gap between her world and his. "It's you," he said simply. "That makes it everything." She'd kissed him for that, for the honesty, for seeing her instead of what she didn't have. And this time there was no hesitation, no pulling back to talk about what this meant. His hands found the hem of her shirt, the question in his eyes clear even without words. "Yes," she breathed, and helped him lift it over her head. He undressed her slowly, reverently, like he was revealing something precious. His mouth traced the curve of her collarbone, the hollow of her throat, the rise of her breasts. When she reached for his shirt, her hands were steadier than she felt, and when his skin met hers she made a sound she didn't recognize as her own. He laid her back on her bed, which she'd made that morning purely by accident, and took his time learning her. Every touch was a question. Every response from her was an answer. His mouth found places that made her arch against him. His hands discovered what made her gasp his name. "Tell me what you want," he murmured against her skin. "You," she said, pulling him up to kiss her. "All of you. Now." When he finally moved over her, into her, filling spaces she hadn't known were empty, she looked into his eyes and saw everything she felt reflected there, desire and tenderness and something deeper that neither of them had said out loud, but both of them knew. They moved together like a perfectly balanced mechanism, each part knowing exactly where it belonged. She wrapped herself around him, taking him deeper, matching his rhythm, until they found something beyond technique, beyond thought, just sensation and connection, and the sound of her name in his mouth when he came undone. Afterward, tangled in sheets damp with sweat and effort, he traced lazy patterns on her spine and spoke into the darkness. "My father is going to hate this," he said. She went still. "Hate what?" "Me falling in love with you." Her heart did something complicated behind her ribs. "You're in love with me?" He propped himself up on one elbow to look at her. "Completely. Probably have been since you told me my great-grandfather's restoration technique was outdated and needed revision." She laughed despite the weight settling into the conversation. "Why will your father hate it?" Julian's expression clouded. "Because you're not what he planned. My mother, she came from a working family too. Machinist's daughter. My father married her young, before his father could stop him, and spent 20 years regretting that she couldn't be managed, couldn't be shaped into what the Mercer family needed her to be. What did she do? She was herself, completely, defiantly herself." His voice carried old grief and older love. "She died when I was 16, and my father, I think part of him was relieved. That's a horrible thing to say about your own father, but I watched him breathe easier at her funeral, like a problem had finally solved itself." Lucia felt cold despite the warmth of his body beside her. "And you think he'll see me the same way?" "I know he will." Julian's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing. But here's what I've decided. I don't care. I spent my whole life watching him try to control everything around him. The business, the family, who we're allowed to love. I'm done letting him write my story. She turned to face him fully. This won't be easy. I know. Your family has power, resources. If they decide I'm a threat. He kissed her, cutting off the worry. Then we'll face it together. But Lucia, I need you to know something. His eyes held hers with absolute certainty. I choose you, whatever comes, I choose you. She wanted to believe him, and in that moment, wrapped in the warmth of what they'd just shared, she did. They married 8 months later in Amos's garden workshop, surrounded by people who loved them for who they were, rather than what they represented. Lucia wore a simple dress the color of champagne. Julian wore his grandfather's watch, and a smile that made her believe in forevers. Lawrence Mercer attended with a face carved from stone, and left before the reception ended. He'll come around, Julian said that night, in the hotel room where they'd promised each other everything. And if he doesn't? She asked. Julian pulled her close, his hands already learning the buttons of her wedding dress. Then he'll miss out on knowing the most extraordinary woman I've ever met. He made love to her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Slow and deep and achingly thorough, like he was writing vows on her skin that went beyond what they'd spoken in front of witnesses. And when they finally collapsed together, exhausted and complete, she let herself believe that love could be enough to weather whatever storm was coming. She was wrong, but not in the way she expected. Before we continue, I need to know, are you watching this alone, or is there someone beside you who needs to hear this story? Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever trusted someone completely, only to have that trust tested? Hit that like button if this story is pulling you in. Don't miss what happens next. For the first year of their marriage, Lucia let herself believe they'd escaped the worst of it. They opened a small independent restoration workshop in the historic district, Mercer and Bergman Horological Restoration, funded by Julian's trust from his mother and Lucia's reputation in the collector community. The work came steady and good: estate pieces, museum contracts, private collectors who cared more about expertise than family name. Lawrence's coldness continued, but from a distance. Obligatory dinners once a month, where he spoke to Julian about business, and to Lucia barely at all. She learned to read him the way she read damaged mechanisms, looking for the stress points, the places where pressure was building, the small signs of impending failure. He's planning something, she told Julian one night, 6 weeks before everything shattered. They were in bed, her head on his chest, his fingers trailing through her hair. He's always planning something, Julian said. It's what he does. This is different. He's asked you 3 times about my access to the business accounts. Julian tensed beneath her. You don't have access to the business accounts. We keep our finances completely separate from Mercer and Sons. I know that. You know that. But he keeps asking like he's establishing something for an audience. You think he's building a narrative. I think, Lucia said carefully, that your father has decided I'm a problem that needs solving, and he's a man who solves problems permanently. Julian pulled her closer. I won't let him touch you. She didn't argue, but she also didn't sleep well that night, or the nights after. And when the federal agents knocked on their workshop door on a cold Tuesday in March, she wasn't surprised. Shocked, terrified, but not surprised. Lucia Bergman Mercer, you're under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, and theft from the Mercer Family Charitable Foundation in the amount of $2.3 million. The world narrowed to the agent's words, and Julian's face going white beside her. That's insane, Julian said. She's never even worked for the foundation. She has no access to. We have documentation, the agent said, producing a folder thick with papers. Signatures, transfer authorizations, bank records. Mrs. Mercer, you have the right to remain silent. The rest disappeared into legal procedure and shock. They cuffed her gently. The agent seemed almost apologetic, and Julian followed them to the federal building demanding lawyers, demanding to see the evidence, demanding they explain how his wife could have stolen from an organization she'd never touched. Bail was set at $500,000. Julian posted it within 3 hours. But something had changed in those 3 hours. She saw it the moment he walked into the holding room, a shadow behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. Doubt. Tiny and unwelcome, but there. Did you see the evidence? She asked. Yes, his voice was rough. And? He ran his hands through his hair, the gesture she'd come to love now just a signal of distress. It's detailed, Lucia. Documents with your signature, transfers from accounts that require dual authorization, timestamps that match days you were at the workshop alone. You know I didn't do this. I know. But he said it too quickly, like he was trying to convince himself. Julian, look at me. He did, and the pain in his eyes broke something in her chest. Do you believe me? She asked. The hesitation was less than a second, but it was there. Of course I believe you, he said. You hesitated. Lucia, you hesitated. She stood, wrapping her arms around herself. Your father showed you papers with my name on them, and you hesitated. That's not fair. You can't expect me to see detailed evidence against you and not have questions. Questions, yes. Doubt? She shook her head. I would have burned that evidence without reading it, if someone had tried to convince me you were guilty of something I knew you'd never do. I wouldn't have needed 3 hours to decide whether I believed you. What do you want me to say? Nothing. She felt exhausted suddenly, bone deep and soul sick. Take me home. We'll deal with the lawyers tomorrow. They drove in silence. That night, in the bed where they'd made love and made promises, they lay on opposite sides with an ocean of cold sheets between them. She didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Lawrence Mercer's careful questions, the way he'd been building his narrative for months, and the look on Julian's face when he'd seen evidence manufactured specifically to exploit the one weakness in their foundation. The class difference neither of them talked about, but both of them carried. Rich men didn't marry working-class women for love, the evidence suggested. They married them because they were marks, easier to manipulate, easier to position with access to family wealth. Lawrence had built a story Julian had spent his whole life being told in 1,000 subtle ways. And in that holding room, for just a second, Julian had believed it. Lucia had spent her life learning to fix broken things, but she'd never learned how to fix a crack in trust once the damage was done. Beside her, Julian's breathing eventually evened into sleep. She lay awake and began planning for a trial she knew Lawrence would make sure she faced alone, even if Julian was sitting right beside her. The federal courthouse on Hamilton Street looked like every other building designed to make people feel small. Marble columns, vaulted ceilings, and the particular kind of echo that made whispers sound like accusations. Lucia sat at the defense table in a navy suit Amos had bought her. You're going to look like exactly who you are, he'd said. Someone who earned everything she has, and watched the prosecution build their case against her with the kind of precision she might have admired under different circumstances. They had everything. Document experts who testified the signatures were hers, bank officials who confirmed the transfers, a forensic accountant who walked the jury through every dollar of the $2.3 million that had moved from the Mercer Family Charitable Foundation into a series of offshore accounts. And Mrs. Mercer had access to these accounts? The prosecutor asked. According to the authorization records, yes, the accountant confirmed. Despite having no official role with the foundation, the access was granted through spousal proxy authorization, signed by both Mr. Julian Mercer and Mrs. Lucia Mercer. Lucia felt the jury's eyes on her, felt their judgment forming in real time. Julian sat in the gallery. Witnesses weren't allowed in the courtroom before testimony, close enough that she could feel his presence, but far enough that she couldn't read his expression without turning around. She didn't turn around, hadn't looked at him since the trial started 3 days ago. They were living in the same house but sleeping in different rooms, speaking through lawyers more than each other. The marriage was bleeding out slowly, and neither of them knew how to stop it. The prosecution rested on the afternoon of the 4th day. Lucia's lawyer, a sharp woman named Rita Soto, who Amos had found through connections in the art fraud world, stood to begin the defense. Your Honor, the defense calls Marcus Okoye to the stand. Lucia had met Marcus once, briefly, in Rita's office. He was a forensic accountant who specialized in financial fraud and had a particular interest in digital document manipulation. He looked like someone's favorite professor, cardigan, glasses, gentle manner, and he took the stand like he had all the time in the world. Rita walked him through his credentials. 30 years in forensic accounting, testimony in over 200 fraud cases, consultant to 3 federal agencies. Then she showed him the evidence. Mr. Okoye, in your professional opinion, are these signatures authentic? Marcus adjusted his glasses and studied the documents projected on the screen. The signatures appear authentic to casual examination. However, when you analyze the pressure patterns and ink distribution at the microscopic level, they show characteristics consistent with high-quality digital reproduction rather than physical signing. A murmur went through the courtroom. Can you elaborate? Certainly. When someone signs a document physically, there are micro-variations in pressure, ink flow, and hand movement that create a unique pattern. These signatures lack those variations. They're too perfect, identical across multiple documents in ways that human hand movement can't replicate. So these are forgeries? Sophisticated digital forgeries, yes. Rita moved to the next exhibit. And these transfer authorizations, can you speak to their authenticity? Marcus pulled up a detailed analysis on his laptop, which projected beside the documents. These show a 14-day discrepancy between the alleged signature date and the metadata embedded in the digital files. The documents claim to have been signed and notarized on March 3rd, but the actual file creation date is February 17th, 2 weeks earlier. What does that suggest? That someone created these documents in advance, backdated them, and then executed the transfers using pre-authorized credentials that Mrs. Mercer never actually provided. The prosecutor stood to object, but Rita cut him off with the next question. Who would have the access and technical capability to execute this kind of fraud? Someone with administrative access to the foundation's banking systems. Someone who could create authorization documents and have them processed without secondary verification. And someone with access to high-quality samples of Mrs. Mercer's signature to create the digital reproductions. Someone like the foundation's director. Objection. The prosecutor was on his feet. Withdrawn, Rita said smoothly. No further questions. The cross-examination tried to poke holes in Marcus's analysis, but he was unshakable. By the time he stepped down, 3 jurors were looking at Lucia differently, not with suspicion, but with something closer to sympathy. Rita called 2 more witnesses, a digital forensics expert who confirmed the metadata discrepancies, and a handwriting analyst who demonstrated the subtle differences between Lucia's actual signature and the ones on the documents. Then Rita stood and said the words Lucia had been waiting weeks to hear. Your Honor, the defense calls Lucia Bergman Mercer to the stand. This is the moment everything changes. Don't scroll away. Don't pause. What Lucia reveals in the next few minutes will redefine everything you think you know about this story. If you're invested in seeing justice served, hit that subscribe button right now. You won't want to miss this. Lucia took the stand with her heart beating steady and her hands calm. She'd spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment, not with Rita, but with the part of herself she'd kept hidden for 3 years. Rita began with simple questions. Background, education, how she'd learned watchmaking from Amos. Then, Mrs. Mercer, what else did you study besides horology? I have a master's degree in forensic accounting from Boston College, Lucia said clearly. Graduated summa cum laude in 2019. The courtroom went silent. I also hold advanced certifications in financial fraud investigation and digital forensics. From 2019 to 2021, I worked as a consultant for the International Art and Antiquities Fraud Division, specializing in provenance fraud and financial crimes related to high-value collectibles. She could feel Julian's shock from across the room, felt Lawrence Mercer's confidence beginning to crack. Why didn't this come up earlier in your background? Rita asked. Because I left that work when I married Julian. I signed non-disclosure agreements about active investigations, and I made a choice to focus on restoration work rather than fraud investigation. I didn't hide my credentials, they're public record, but I didn't advertise them either. Why not? Lucia's eyes found Julian in the gallery for the first time since the trial started. Because I fell in love with a man whose family was under preliminary investigation for foundation fraud, and I didn't want him to have to choose between me and them. So I recused myself from the investigation, left the division, and tried to build a different life. You were investigating the Mercer Family Charitable Foundation. The division was, I became aware of irregularities in their tax filings that matched patterns I'd seen in other cases. Shell transfers, backdated authorizations, inflated charitable claims. When I met Julian, it was genuinely by chance. He hired me to restore a watch. I fell in love with him for real, and I made the choice to walk away from an investigation rather than deceive someone I loved. She pulled a folder from beneath her seat, evidence Rita had filed under seal, and passed it to the bailiff. These are communications between myself and my former supervisor at the fraud division, dated from the week I met Julian through the week before our wedding. They document my decision to recuse myself, my disclosure of the personal relationship, and my recommendation that the preliminary investigation be closed due to my conflict of interest. Rita took the folder, showed it to the judge and the prosecution. The prosecutor's face went carefully blank. Mrs. Mercer, when you were arrested, did you recognize the pattern of the fraud you were accused of? Immediately. It matched the exact methodology of the irregularities I'd originally identified in the Mercer Foundation. The same 14-day filing gaps, the same digital signature reproduction technique, the same offshore routing structure. Someone had taken the actual fraud they'd been committing and reconstructed it to frame me. Do you know who? Lucia's eyes moved from Julian to Lawrence Mercer, sitting 3 rows back, his face a mask that was finally beginning to slip. I have suspicions, but what I have definitively are the original case files from my preliminary investigation, which I turned over to the FBI yesterday under subpoena. They show a pattern of foundation fraud dating back 7 years, long before I ever met Julian Mercer. And they show that the fraud accelerated significantly in the 6 months after our marriage, as if someone was building a stockpile of evidence to use against me. Rita smiled. No further questions, Your Honor. The prosecutor declined to cross-examine. The judge called a recess. And in the gallery, Lawrence Mercer stood and walked out of the courtroom, alone, his carefully constructed case collapsing around him like a mechanism with a broken mainspring. The judge dismissed all charges 2 hours later. The prosecutor withdrew the case without argument, citing new evidence that fundamentally undermined the investigation. There was no dramatic reading of a verdict, just paperwork and the quiet sound of Lucia's name being cleared. She walked out of the courtroom flanked by Rita and Amos and found Julian waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps. He looked wrecked, eyes red, face drawn, everything about him radiating exhaustion and regret. Can we talk? He asked. She nodded, and they walked in silence to the waterfront park 2 blocks away, where they'd eaten lunch on their second date, and Julian had told her about learning watchmaking from his grandfather. You must hate me, he said finally. I don't hate you. I doubted you. When it mattered most, I let my father's manufactured evidence make me question everything I knew about you. Lucia sat on a bench overlooking the water. Julian sat beside her, careful not to touch. You hurt me, she said. When you hesitated in that holding room, when I saw doubt in your eyes, it broke something I don't know how to fix. I know, his voice cracked, and I can't take it back. But Lucia, I need you to know something. He pulled out his phone and showed her a series of documents, emails, file transfers, meeting notes. What is this? The day after I bailed you out, I started my own investigation. I broke into my father's office, hired a private forensic accountant, pulled foundation records going back a decade. He scrolled through the evidence. I found the discrepancies, the same 14-day gaps, the pattern you'd been investigating. I brought it all to Rita a week before the trial started. Lucia stared at the documentation. You investigated your own father? I let doubt win for one moment. One horrible moment. But then I remembered who you are, how you think, how you move through the world with this integrity that's so bone deep you'd walk away from an investigation rather than lie to someone you love. His eyes met hers, raw with emotion. I knew my father was capable of this. I've watched him destroy people my whole life. I just didn't want to believe he'd do it to you, to us. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed you to hear it in court, from witnesses who couldn't be dismissed as a husband defending his wife. I needed the truth to be unimpeachable. He took her hand carefully, like he wasn't sure he still had the right. But I should have told you I believed you. I should have said it every day. I'm sorry I let you feel alone in this. Lucia felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. Your father is going to face charges. I know. I'm the one who brought the evidence to the FBI. Julian's jaw tightened. He tried to destroy you, to prove you weren't good enough for this family. Instead, he proved the family wasn't good enough for you. And you? Me? He shifted closer, his free hand coming up to cup her face. I'm going to spend however long it takes proving that I am, that I can be, that the man who doubted you for one moment is not the man I actually am. She leaned into his touch, feeling tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally spill over. I loved you enough to walk away from my career. You loved me enough to investigate your own father. Maybe we're both a little broken right now. Then we fix it, he said, together, the way we fix everything else. She kissed him then, not the passionate urgency of their early days, but something slower, sadder, and somehow more real. A kiss that tasted like grief and forgiveness, and the tentative hope that broken things could be restored if you were patient enough, skilled enough, and cared enough to try. They rebuilt slowly, carefully, like conservators working on a damaged piece too valuable to rush. Julian moved back into their bedroom 3 weeks after the trial ended, and they lay awake most of that first night just talking. About his mother, about Lucia's investigation work, about all the things they'd kept hidden because they were afraid of being fully known. "I want to know all of you," he said in the darkness. "Even the parts that scare me, especially those parts." She told him about the cases she'd worked, the fraud rings, the money laundering, the beautiful lies people built around stolen things. He told her about growing up watching his father manipulate people like they were chess pieces, and the relief he'd felt when he'd finally chosen watchmaking over the family business. "I think I chose it because watches don't lie," he said. "They're exactly what they are. When they're broken, you can see why. When you fix them, they work. There's no pretending." "That's exactly what I said," Lucia whispered. "The first night we worked together. That's exactly what I said." He pulled her closer. "Maybe that's why I fell in love with you. You were the first person who understood that I needed the truth to be something I could hold in my hands and measure." They made love that night for the first time since the arrest, slow and achingly tender, relearning each other with a vulnerability they'd never quite allowed before. His hands trembled when he touched her. She whispered his name like a prayer, and when he moved inside her, she wrapped herself around him and felt something broken finally beginning to heal. Afterward, tangled together in sheets and moonlight, he traced the curve of her spine and said, "I choose you. Every day, every version of you, every truth you've been afraid to tell me, I choose you. Even though I come with fraud investigations and family drama and a really inconvenient sense of ethics." He laughed, the first real laugh she'd heard from him in months. "Especially because of those things." 6 months later, Mercer and Bergman Horological Restoration moved to a larger space in the historic district, funded entirely by Lucia's new consulting contract with the FBI's Art Fraud Division and Julian's inheritance from his mother's trust. Lawrence Mercer stepped down from Mercer & Sons under federal investigation. Julian severed all ties. They didn't speak at the hearing, didn't acknowledge each other in the hallway. "Do you regret it?" Lucia asked afterward. "No," Julian said. "I regret that it took me so long. But I don't regret choosing you over a man who tried to destroy the person I love most." Their workshop thrived. Lucia split her time between restoration and consultation work. Julian designed a new line of timepieces under his mother's name. And on their 3rd anniversary, in the same garden where they'd married, Lucia gave him a watch she'd built from scratch, every piece cut and finished by hand, the movement visible through a sapphire caseback, and engraved on the inside. Every piece has a purpose. Everything fits together. This is us. He kissed her there among the tools and the flowers, and she felt the absolute certainty that some things, once broken and properly restored, become stronger than they ever were whole. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling me what you felt. I read every single one. Subscribe to Mr. Cael Stories for more narratives that challenge you, move you, and stay with you. And remember, the truth always finds its way to the surface. Always.